So, dude, Gavin, I was just checking plane tickets and I found something that you'd probably not expect. A little bit of a fun fact for your next trivia night.
Ooh.
What is the only African airline that flies to Japan and to Korea? And on top of that, it flies between both countries, Japan and Korea. It's an African airline. Any
Well,
guesses?
Dave, it can only be one airline because there's only one African
What? Air
airline that will
Senegal?
fly
Air
around like that.
Senegal?
No, it's not Air Chad. It's not Air Senegal. I'm pretty sure it's not Air Madagascar. It has to be Ethiopian Airlines.
Really? It's got to be Ethiopian.
It's got to be
I think
Ethiopian.
you're right. From what I remember, it was like started with an E. It could be Eritrea, but probably Ethiopian would be right,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's a little. I don't think it's Eritrean National Airlines, Dave.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Anyways, hello, listeners. Today we're flying into the Horn of Africa, and we're flying into on the Fringe. I'm Gavin, and this is.
I'm Dave.
And today we're flying you into a corner of the world that people, quite honestly, ought to be more familiar with, but aren't. And this, of course, is the wonderful Horn of Africa. And at the center of the Horn of Africa is the country of Ethiopia, the Republic of Ethiopia, in the middle of the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is in East Africa. It's right next to the Arabian Peninsula. It's the little bit of East Africa that juts out into the Indian Ocean. And of course, it's a strategically important location because the Red Sea, the straits between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean go right above it. So it's a very important location. It's also considered, Ethiopia is considered to be the cradle of humanity. As far as we can tell, human beings, Homo sapiens, evolved somewhere in the vicinity of the Great Rift Valley a very long time ago. But we're not talking about that today. What are we talking about, Dave?
We are going to be talking about some issues going on within Ethiopia that were going on in the past, still going on today, and also kind of what's going on in the region and kind of why this is important and why we should be talking more about Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. It's something that's not really on anybody's radar, so to speak, and it's kind of coming on and coming off. I mean, most of us know about Ethiopia. Oh, there's famines and there's people on TV that are starving and begging for money at Christmas time. And there's a lot more to the region than just that. I mean, it is very impoverished in a lot of places, but it's also growing economically. And it's had tremendous economic growth over the last 10 to 15 years. And it may have more economic growth in the future if these countries can get everything right.
And I just want to confess right at the top of the podcast, I have definite vested interest in this because I used to live in Ethiopia on and off for about 4 years. My parents worked there. I spent at least really, I spent about 2 or 3 summers out there. I got my first paycheck job working in Ethiopia. And to give you an idea of how kind of surreal that
Was
was,
it child labor, Gavin? Was it child labor?
no, it was an internship at the Institute for Livestock Research. It was the International Livestock Research Institute in Addis Ababa. And I, through connections, was able to get an internship there. And it was wildly surreal, is the best way of describing it, but it was a little disturbing because obviously most of the people in Ethiopia still, and most of the people in the Horn of Africa still, uh, the main livelihood for the majority of the workforce is subsistence agriculture. That's how most people get by. And I think this is in 2011, so it was the same year that South Sudan got independence. Um,
Yeah,
I
it's
was
back in the
there,
day.
It was back in the day. And it's interesting. I'll tie this into a issue that we're going to be talking about today. So there are a couple of things going on. First of all, in that summer, there was a massive famine on the Horn of Africa that was mostly affecting Somalia, but was also affecting southern Ethiopia. And when I say it was a bad famine, they had, I think, drought 2 years in a row. Temperatures were skyrocketing. It was really bad. I think somewhere between 800,000 and like 1.2 million people wound up dying because of this.
Wow.
This is really a horrifying event. But because this was going on in the south of the country, I was in Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is up, very elevated. It's up on a giant plateau, which makes up most of northern and central Ethiopia. And it was
I just want
raining.
to jump in. How big is Addis? Like, how big of a city is it? I've never been.
Off the top of my head, it's about 6 million people, maybe 7. It's huge. It's really big. I know it's expanded a lot since I was there. The last time I was there outside the airport would have been 2014. So it's been a decade. I know it's expanded massively. It was massive when I was there. It's a very big city. It's a very new city, actually. It only became a permanent settlement at the turn of the century. And I think at this point, I can now make the historical leap, and quickly explain Ethiopian history. So Ethiopia is an anomalous country. It's a pretty unique country in Eastern Africa and definitely in Africa generally. It's there's been some kind of centralized state there for an incredibly long time. Depending on who you ask, I mean, most people would say Aksum was founded in 400 BC. So that's a very long time ago. There's been a central state in the Ethiopian highlands for an incredibly long time. Again, birthplace of humanity, very, very close to some of the earliest civilizations. At the same time, we're seeing things in Egypt and Mesopotamia. We're seeing things in Ethiopia too. So it's been around for a very long time. It's the second oldest.
It's one of the first Christian countries too, right? Like it in Armenia.
It's the second oldest Christian state in the world. The first, again, you want to talk about pub trivia. The first Christian country in the world, first officially Christian country in the world, is Armenia. Not a lot of people remember, but it is Armenia. The second is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, I think, converted at some point in the 4th or 5th centuries, so AD. So very early on, it became a Christian state. All sorts of political fluctuations, kings broke away, dynasties fell, rise and ebb of power. It was never officially colonized. It was never colonized. It maintained a degree of independence. The Italians tried to invade it in 1896. They were pretty devastatingly defeated. Ethiopia at that point was kind of supported by the British and the Russians because there's the Orthodox connection. Ethiopia historically has been an Orthodox Christian country. So there was that connection. They were able to repel, again, they were a centralized state. They were able to repel the Italian colonial forces to Eritrea and what's now Somalia. And they maintained independence until 1936. They get invaded by Mussolini. Absolutely brutal, brutal conquest. Hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians were killed. The intelligentsia, most of them were shot. Widespread use of chemical weapons, one of the first widespread uses of chemical weapons outside of World War I. Really horrible, horrible campaign. So in 1936, Ethiopia is absorbed into Italian East Africa. It was supposed to be the sort of the jewel in the crown of the Italian colonial empire. Didn't work. because a little thing called World War II happened, and the Ethiopian Empire, sorry, the Ethiopian Emperor in exile, who is a fellow named Haile Selassie, also known as Rastafari, he he came back in 1942 with British assistance, and the Italians were kicked out of Ethiopia. And they actually got Eritrea, which had been a part of the Italian colonial empire. They got Eritrea as well. And this ties into what we're going to be talking about today. Eritrea was the entire coastline of Ethiopia. If you look at it on a map, Eritrea is this funky little wishbone type shaped country that's almost all coastline with a little bit of the highlands thrown in. And Ethiopia doesn't have a coastline today. That happened later. So in 1945, the Ethiopians take Eritrea. Of course, if you're an Ethiopian nationalist, you'll probably disagree with me, but we can deal with that later. And Haile Selassie stays as the emperor of Ethiopia until 1974, and he's deposed by a communist junta named the Derg that most people have never heard of. No one's ever heard of the Derg outside of Ethiopia, I think. Extraordinarily brutal military regime aligned with the Soviet Union. Again, and one of the reasons they got rid of Haile Selassie was because there had been numerous famines under the empire that were not really addressed. Hundreds of thousands of people died, probably millions of people. Really, that doesn't get better under the Derg. That's one of the justifications used for removing Haile Selassie, but that doesn't get better. About 20 years of mismanagement, and then in 1987, the Civil War starts. The sort of the wheels come off the cart in 87, and 91, something called the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia is founded. That's still the official name today. And at the center of that is a guy named Meles Zenawi. And I'll stop chattering now, but Meles Zenawi was kind of the guy running things for a very long time. And I forget exactly when he died, but he died while I was there. He died in 2012. So
I think it was mid 2012. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah,
it was about mid 2012, and Meles basically held the country together when Ethiopia overthrew the Derg. And basically, Meles' ethnic group, the Tigrayans, largely took power in Ethiopia. So the Tigrayans are a small ethnic group. They're only, I think, about 8 to 10% of the population in Ethiopia, but they became not even that. So they largely became in charge of the country's government. They're primarily up in the northern part of Ethiopia, and this all kind of comes into play later on.
So just to interject here, we're now, as you're probably already very aware, we're now in very sensitive territory. One of the complaints against the Ethiopian state for a very long time, and it's worth mentioning too, that the Eritreans get independence. I also want to say around 91.
Yeah, I think it was 91.
It was 91.
They left, or they declared independence and broke back away from Ethiopia. So then 91. Ethiopia was landlocked again.
Yeah, and Ethiopia is still landlocked, which is sort of the nub of the issue today. So, yes, the Tigrayans are not a large ethnic group. The second biggest ethnic group in Ethiopia are a group called the Amhara. And the Amhara were the core of Imperial Ethiopia. When you talk about Ethiopian culture abroad, most of what you're getting is some kind of Amhara or Amhara-ish culture. They were sort of the core of the imperium. And this was not particularly loved by the other ethnic groups, of which there are so many. There's just a massive constellation. The largest group is actually a group called the Oromo, which has several large and fairly violent and fairly well organized secessionist groups working within the Oromo. So there's the Oromo, there's the Amhara, there's the Tigray way up in the north. There's also the Tigrinya, which are the main ethnic group in Eritrea, who are very similar to the Tigray. They're very closely related, those two groups. But of course, the Tigrinya are a much larger group proportionally in Eritrea than the Tigray are in Ethiopia. I want to say, I don't know exactly, but it's below 7%. It's very small.
Yeah, I thought it was like, if I remember, it was like 5 to 6 or something like that. I might
think
be
it's
wrong.
somewhere. Unfortunately, because of recent events, it's probably less than that. But it used to be about 5 or 6. And
two, I want to make one quick point as well. So if you see something written in an Ethiopian language, it's normally in the Amhara language.
Yes.
So most of the other ethnic groups, if they're communicating in Ethiopia with Ethiopians, they're using the Amhara language. It's kind of the national, I guess, de facto language of Ethiopia and of their government. The official language, I guess, is probably the best way to say it.
Yes, it is the official language. When you're talking about Ethiopian, you're talking about Amharic. And yes, so how did a group like the Tigray get into power? Meles was very smart in some ways. He had organized a group called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which was this sort of democratic, socialistic group that had representatives, ostensibly had representatives from every ethnic group in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was actually reorganized, so all of the states corresponded to ethnic groups. Much, I think, ominously, much in the same way that like Yugoslavia used to be organized. So you can already tell this is not a great setup. But the dominant, not officially, but unofficially, the dominant group in the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front was the TPLF, which is the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And they, again, this is pretty unofficial. They more or less dominated internal politics in Ethiopia from 1991 to 2012, is again when things start to move around a little bit.
Well, they largely overthrew the Derg as well, right? I mean, most of the fighting.
Yeah. No, they did the heavy lifting.
Was done by the Tigrayans.
Yes.
So the Tigrayans are looking at this and going, "We did the work. We're gonna basically take our spoils."
And look, they tried to make the federalist framework work. There was a lot of lip service paid to it. It wasn't thrown up and disregarded. But it was also, I mean, when I was there was a lot of resentment that was built up towards the Tigrayans. And from what I heard, in the years after Meles's death, it only got worse and worse and worse. And finally, there was an internal power struggle in the EPRDF, and a fellow named Abiy Ahmed came to the fore. Abiy Ahmed is still the leader in Ethiopia today. He's still the big dog. He's been there since 2018. And, oh, yeah, I mean, this is always a bad
sign. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, too, in 2019.
He won. So, I mean, you and
That's another pub trivia.
It is. I think you
So
you and I have had this
if you
conversation.
win, please don't forget us.
Don't you forget about. Sorry. Anyways,
Don't you?
yeah, Dave's much more musical than I am for obscure reasons. Anyways, so I just want to say to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, the people who pick these people, just whatever the hell you do, never ever give someone the Nobel Peace Prize in the first year of them holding office. I didn't approve of it, and I was someone who had a generally favorable outlook on his presidency. I didn't like it when they did it with Obama. I thought it was a bad idea. I thought it had a bad effect overall. And boy, when they did it to Abiy Ahmed, geez, things just went from bad to worse. Because about a year after they did that, and I'll explain why they did that in a second. So there was a war in the late 90s. There was a war that broke out in 1998 between Eritrea and Ethiopia over the border, which was not at that point clearly defined. Eritrea is still under the rule of the man who led it to independence in 1991, Isaias Afwerki. He's still there. He's not going anywhere. He's in his late 70s, I believe. He is extraordinarily dictatorial. Eritrea is one of the most authoritarian states on the planet Earth. They are the North Korea of Africa. It's a very bad place to live in many ways. Incredibly military.
I was going to say the same thing. Look on the Press Freedom Index or Freedom House or any of these indexes in terms of personal freedom or press freedom. And Eritrea is at the bottom. Some of them even rank lower than North Korea.
If you have less press freedom than Turkmenistan, you are not doing things well. Let me just put it that way. You are not doing things well. So this is Eritrea. And one of the things that I'm going to come across here, or I'm hoping to bring across here, is that the Horn of Africa is a region of so much potential, and there has been so much tragedy in such a compressed period of time. Ethiopia has so many problems going on right now, so many major tragedies in its recent history, so many ongoing tragedies, and yet compared to most of the countries around it, it's kind of doing pretty well. So Eritrea is this incredibly militarized state. They go to war with Ethiopia in 1998. Devastating conflict. I knew veterans from that conflict. I knew people who had lost family members in that conflict. It was one of the last, I believe, before the Russian-Ukrainian war broke out. I believe it was one of the last examples of trench warfare in the 20th century. Again, hundreds of thousands of people dead. Awful, devastating conflict that no one's ever heard of. Left massive scars on both countries. Abiy Ahmed gets into power, and within a year, negotiates with Isaias Afwerki, and they sign a peace treaty, and they have diplomatic relations. And this is seen as this massive, huge lightning step that no one could have ever predicted, and they give him the Nobel Peace Prize. They even opened up flights between Ethiopia and Asmara, which when I was living there, that was seen as like this totally impossible thing, that they would actually allow transportation between the two capitals. Asmara is the capital of Eritrea. They've actually stopped that like a week ago. They stopped that flight.
Yeah, I saw that Ethiopian.
Yeah, and we'll get to why they did that, because that was an Eritrean move, and it was a very calculated one. So Abiy Ahmed does this wonderful thing. He signs this peace treaty. The borders have kind of opened. There's back and forth. There's trade. In the middle of this, he renames his political party. It's the Prosperity Party now, and he does away with the federal structure within the party. He makes it ostensibly non-ethnic, non-federalist. It's a unitary party. And it's worth mentioning, Abiy Ahmed is not Tigray. Abiy Ahmed is Oromo, but tends to identify culturally with the Amhara. So he was very much seen as someone who could appeal to a broader swath of the Ethiopian public. And I think he did in some ways. He's not Orthodox Christian. He's Pentecostal. He's a practicing Pentecostal. There's a growing population of Protestants in Ethiopia. He's a member of that community. So he's reorganizing the party. And of course, the big losers in that are the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, who dissent, who say, we're not going to join the Prosperity Party. We're going to continue running our own thing. And actually, we're not really sure about this federal state. We don't think it's working for us. We're going to sort of run our own ship, and you can do what you want in Addis, but we're less and less interested in what you have to say. These things escalated. They also escalated because Tigray, and actually all of the ethnic states to one degree or another, but Tigray especially, Tigray has its own army. So they began mobilizing their military forces. And they were told they couldn't hold elections. They said, we don't care. We're going to hold elections anyways. They were told not to. They went ahead. Of course, they won the elections. And then the Ethiopian army moves in with probably one of the most unpredicted, or at least unimaginable conflicts. They got the Eritreans to join with them. So the Ethiopian army actually called the Eritreans in to put down an internal revolt. They got Isaias of Werki to send his army into northern Ethiopia. And pretty horrifying conflict resulted, particularly if you were a Tigrayan civilian. Just incredible accounts of massacres, mass rapes, just all the most horrible things you could imagine. The Eritrean army is not big on the idea of human rights, generally.
Surprise, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it turns out neither is the Ethiopian army. So, and the Tigrayans, to their credit, fought back against this pretty consistently for about 2 years. We don't know exactly how many people died. It's in the millions. We know that. It was a couple million people.
And you had blockades. Basically, the Ethiopian army would stop food aid. They would stop any sort of communications. They basically did everything they could to squeeze the Tigrayans into surrendering, into stopping fighting. And the Tigrayans just refused to stop.
I mean, war crime after war crime.
It was as brutal as it could get on both sides. I mean, the Tigrayans did the same things to the Ethiopians, so it just turned into war crime on top of war crime on top of war crime committed by everyone on every side.
And of course,
the Eritreans, the Tigrayans, and the Ethiopians. It was just absolutely brutal.
Incredibly brutal, incredibly tragic conflict, and very much spearheaded by Abiy Ahmed. Very much the result of his political leadership. But not a lot.
Well, I was going to say real quick, it started during COVID, right? Because the Tigrayans wanted to have a local election, and Abiy said, no, you can't have it. And the Tigrayans said, well, we're going to have the election. And they ended up having the election and thumbing their nose at Abiy. And then tension started to boil, and then the TPLF attacked Ethiopia's forces, and then the whole thing just blew up.
Yeah. And then total disaster, really total disaster. So that is wound down, And because Ethiopia, I mean, how many people live in Ethiopia, Dave?
There's like 108 million. It's the second or third most populated country in Africa. Nigeria is number one. And
Egypt
then
number two.
I think Ethiopia is second, but it might be the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo.
No, no,
I
no,
think
no.
it's Ethiopia's second.
No, it's Nigeria. It'd be Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's third.
DRC has a lot of people, but it's not close to those three.
Okay.
So now Abiy Ahmed's political project, and again, he more or less escaped major international reproach for this because Ethiopia is seen as, I would say, the future of Africa. It has a growing population. Its economic growth is astronomical. It's starting to really get into light manufacturing. As we talked about at the beginning of the program, it's a transportation hub, kind of unlike anywhere else on the continent. It's really a place with an incredible amount of potential. And they have, unfortunately, they have a very large army with a lot of equipment supplied by all kinds of people. What they don't have, what they don't have,
I think. Go ahead.
Sorry, what they don't have is a coastline. So right now, Abiy Ahmed is looking for a coastline, and that is turning into, coupled with dam issues, which maybe we'll talk about later, kind of snowballing into a new crisis.
Yes. And I mean, you look at it, and since Ethiopia does not have a coastline, what options they have? So you can build a rail line from Ethiopia to the Red Sea. And they did that. The Chinese actually financed a train
going through what country, Dave?
Ethiopia to the port of Djibouti. Huh?
Djibouti.
Djibouti, going to Djibouti. Hopefully.
I'm sorry, people who live in Djibouti. We love you and we love your country, but we're very immature. Now, Djibouti.
Yes, we're like 12. We're constantly just around 12-year-olds in our minds and in our lives, so we just can't get away from it.
At least I have an excuse.
We still listen to pop punk too, so don't blame us.
So, Djibouti used to be called French Somaliland. That's what it was. It was the French part of the Somali territory. And it's a very nice, very attractive port. However, it's not a part of Ethiopia, and it's not going to be a part of Ethiopia because Djibouti is host to military bases from basically every country in the world. The United States has a large military base in Djibouti. France has a large military base there. China has a large naval base. Japan has a large naval base. I think Italy has a camp there. Everyone is in Djibouti. Snicker. And it's just not an ideal setup. It's also somewhat dangerous because, yes, there is a rail line, but there's really only one line going to that port. And as Otis discovered, really horrifically, during the Eritrean Ethiopian War, if you cut that line, that's kind of it. Nothing's going in and out of Otis, which is part of the reason why they've invested so much in the airlines.
And too, you've got to look at it. One of their largest imports is actually wheat. I think wheat is their largest import. So if these guys can't get huge quantities of wheat into the country, they're already dealing with food insecurity. What are they going to do? They've got to have some way to get food crops into the country and then export coffee and other agricultural products
That's basically their economy. Apart from Ethiopian Airlines, it's very, very simple. Like Gavin was saying, it's mostly subsistence farming and people doing a little bit of light manufacturing. So the country really does have a lot of potential, but it's basically needing to try to capitalize on it, and it needs the infrastructure in place to actually be able to capitalize on it.
And unfortunately, in the meantime, you have this increasingly expansionist nationalist policy towards the neighbors, which is now manifested in Ethiopia signed a treaty with the government of Somaliland. Now, Somaliland is not an internationally recognized country. No country on the face of the planet Earth recognizes Somaliland. It's a de facto independent state, but it's not internationally recognized. Somaliland is the former British Somalia. So Somalia, the country of Somalia today, is actually composed of two colonies. It's composed of British Somaliland and Italian Somalia. And of course, when they got independence, the former Italian part, kind of dominated the North. And then when Somalia collapsed in the 90s, there's a theme here. When Somalia collapsed in 91, Somaliland broke off, and it's been happily doing its own thing for a while. And they have signed a treaty with Ethiopia, which Ethiopia may recognize them as an independent country in return for Somaliland essentially handing over a rail line and a port facilities to Ethiopia. This has created problems with the Somali government.
Yes. And two, we haven't even started talking about the GERD, the big dam in Western Ethiopia. But
big old
that
dam.
is creating. You there?
Yeah. So I just thought I'd
back. We didn't drop off the face of the earth, everybody.
Yeah.
We just hit our 40-minute limit.
We're on the free account because we're poor. So let's start off with first of all, I realize I'm talking a lot. Second of all, I'm sure there's some listeners who've listened to the first part and gone, holy fuck, I have no idea what's going on. None of that made any sense. I know Ethiopia is like this old Christian country in the middle of the Horn of Africa, and it seems to have really bad relationships with all of its neighbors. And there seems to be really complicated stuff going on inside of it. But other than that, there are all these acronyms, there are all these ethnic groups. It's impossible to keep it all in order. Everyone seems to be in shifting love-hate relationships where they're attacking each other and then they're defending each other. You know what? If you're listening to this, it's not my poor storytelling abilities. That's kind of how it is. It is the Horn of Africa is one of the most fascinating places in the world politically, because it is kaleidoscopically brutal and awful and over the top. And oh my God, there's so much going on at any one given moment. And it's really important. It's a really important part of the world. So don't worry if that didn't make a lot of sense. Hopefully this next part is a little clearer. So I talk about Somalia. So Ethiopia is this incredibly old country. And next to it, you have this old, less centralized region that has generally been referred to as Somalia or Somaliland or the Somalilands. And it's this very large, it's basically the coast of the Horn. That's Somalia, that wraparound on the Horn of Africa. And when you talk about Somalis as a people, as a culture, as an ethnic group, you're really talking about this massive conglomeration of very different groups that identify as Somali. But really, the important unit to remember when you're talking about Somalia are the clans. So the clans are very important. They're basically the foundational block of Somali society. So Somalia has a different history than Ethiopia. They are colonized. They're colonized by the French, the British, and the Italians. The Italian and the British Somalias unify in the 60s. That's the Republic of Somalia today. The French colony goes off as Djibouti. Somalia is a extremely centralized socialist state under a gentleman named Siad Barre until 1991. And then basically all hell breaks loose. I'm not going to go into the Somali Civil War. It just totally falls apart. Various competing factions, really awful stuff. And there is no real internationally recognized government. There's a group that is sort of running things called the Islamic Courts Union. They're not recognized by anyone. They're eventually superseded by another group called Al-Shabaab, who are much more notorious. And they're basically the Somali equivalent of the Taliban. Not nice customers at all. And they're not internationally recognized as anything other than a terrorist group. In about 2012, there were various machinations, most of them American. The US was very involved in this. There's something called the Federal Republic of Somalia. And that's a government of politicians, most of whom were in the diaspora, who were brought back to Mogadishu and slowly established a government. They still don't control most of the country. As I said in the first half, the Republic of Somaliland is its own separate thing. No one recognizes them, but they're running their own ship. In the north, you have this territory called Puntland, which recognizes the government, but they do their own thing. And then you have Al-Shabaab, which is actually running most of the countryside. And the Somali government doesn't have much of an army. Most of the military forces in Somalia, up until very recently, were all clan-based. So their loyalty was not really to the government. Their loyalty was to their leader or their leader's leader. So it's this very complex, difficult, violent situation, on top of which it's a territory very prone to famine. They had major issues with piracy. I'm not going to go into that. They're still fighting Al-Shabaab. They're not doing tremendously well. They're helped by the fact that in the western border of the country, there are about 8,000 Ethiopian troops that have been permanently stationed there since 2012. And they do a lot of tactical heavy lifting against Al-Shabaab. Those troops are about to be withdrawn, or at least the Somali government has formally asked for them to be withdrawn, because after Abiy Ahmed signed the deal with Somaliland for the port space, so he signed the deal with a government that no one recognizes. So the Somali government basically said, you can't do this. You're taking our territory. You're not taking their territory. You're taking our territory. You haven't talked to us. This is a violation of our sovereignty, which they're not really wrong about. The Ethiopian response was more or less, mind your own business. No one cares what you think. Maybe not the best response in hindsight. The Somalis just inked a deal this week with the Egyptian government to send 10,000 Egyptian troops to Somalia to formally help the Somali government fight Al-Shabaab. Informally, They're there to guard the western border with Ethiopia. And this is incredibly alarming to the Ethiopian government because they have had an ongoing, massive, massive issue with the Egyptians over what big river, Dave?
The Nile. And too, I was going to just jump in real quick before we go to that the eastern and southeastern part of Ethiopia is very, very porous. And the Ethiopian government has had problems securing and keeping that area safe from al-Shabaab and other separatist and terrorist groups in that part of Ethiopia. So having the Egyptians on that side of the border, the other side of the border, just raises the alarm that much more, especially because of what's going on in Western Ethiopia with the construction of the GERD and the Egyptians farther down the Nile being very upset and being very angry that Ethiopia now will largely have more control over the flow of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which will affect Egypt and affect Egypt's population potentially in terms of getting water and being able to grow cotton and things like that on the Nile River. So,
well, I mean,
this is a very, very,
No, I mean, I was just going to say you can't underestimate the importance of the Nile to the countries on it. To Ethiopia, the GERD is just the biggest game changer in the world. You're going to be essentially self-sufficient in electricity. This is a massive thing for any country in that part of the world. For Sudan and Egypt, and Sudan, of course, has its own massive problems, which we'll have to get to later. To Sudan and Egypt, it's everything. The whole country, in both countries, the whole country is effectively on the river. If you take the river away, people will die. This isn't hyperbole. If the water levels go down, people will die. The situation.
And if you look at a population map of Egypt, the whole entire thing along the Nile River is red. Literally everyone in Egypt lives along the Nile River.
Yeah.
It's that serious.
And Sudan, even now, even with the war, even with the terrible, terrible population displacement, there are a lot of people living on the river. And if the river dries up, if the river becomes unseasonable, if the water's not coming, that Egypt isn't the most stable country to begin with. And this is to the Egyptian government, and I think correctly. And I'm not sympathetic to one side or another in this conflict, because I think this is fundamentally just a very difficult geopolitical issue. For Egypt, this is an existential issue. If you dam the river, the government is not going to survive. It's not going to happen. The population's extraordinarily unhappy with how they're handling the situation in Palestine and Gaza. It's not a popular government to begin with, and they are incredibly concerned about what could happen if there's even a slight disruption in the water level on the Nile. And to be fair to them,
going to just jump in real quick.
No,
they were expecting potentially the flow of the Nile is likely to drop about 20 to 25%. So that's a big change. And if they lose 25% of the flow of the Nile, these guys are either going to have to get better technology or get better access to technology where they have to develop it, or pay someone like the Israelis to come in and help them actually develop this technology.
Dave,
and we all know what's going on right now in Gaza, and the war in Gaza right now complicates this issue so much. This is a huge issue that nobody is talking about.
Dave, to be fair, I think even without that, that would be an unlikely scenario for a lot of reasons. But it's 100% not going to happen now. And one of the things I really have to say is, even if they did that, again, a lot of people are going to die before you get anywhere close to that capacity. Mm-hmm. So this is a really key issue for the Egyptian government. Very rightly, they're really concerned about it, and they're concerned about it to the extent. It's also worth noting that in Africa generally, and we're speaking about 54 countries generally, which I understand is a dangerous thing to do. Most countries don't have really big militaries, but there are two major exceptions to that. One is East Africa, and the other is North Africa. And in North Africa, and I can say, because I've spent a lot of time in that part of the world, in North Africa, they have absolutely massive armies, and they are well equipped, and they are prepared to use them. So this is a little terrifying for Ethiopia. If it's just the Somali army, they don't have a lot to worry about. 10,000 Egyptian troops with tanks, with artillery, with attack helicopters, with
drones,
which the Ethiopians also used to great effect in the war against Tigray, and it's also worth noting. It's also worth noting that intimately involved in what's going on is not only Egypt, but particularly two countries in the Gulf. Saudi and the UAE are very wrapped up in the goings-on in the Horn of Africa. The United Arab Emirates, particularly, has a very close relationship with Ethiopia and Somaliland. And they were probably involved in brokering that treaty in the first place. They definitely have sold all kinds of drones to the Ethiopian army. They were definitely involved in that. They were giving them military aid. And they're very heavily involved in military action in the region. The Egyptians are involved in Somalia. I would imagine there's some probably behind the scenes Saudi support. The Egyptian government is very tied into what Saudi Arabia tells them to do. So I would imagine they would have at least gotten approval from someone in Saudi before they did this. It's also just worth noting that Turks are also heavily involved. Turkey has a major presence in Ethiopia. Again, they sold a lot of drones during the war. They also are very close to Somalia, and it's worth noting, I think right now, the Republic of Turkey has 2,000 troops stationed around Mogadishu. So they're militarily involved as well. So there were a lot of power players from the Middle East involved. And, everyone's hoping that there's a sit down. There were rumors that I heard that there was recently a major summit. Well, there is a major summit going on in Beijing right now between the Chinese and the African leaders. And I was told that Isaias Afwerki was in a breakout room with General Burhan, who's the current leader of the military in Sudan. So my suspicion is those two are probably involved in trying to get people to a table because this is the 10,000 troops going to Somalia, and we think they've started arriving already. That is a major escalation, and the response from Ethiopia has been intemperate. They are extraordinarily PO'd, and they are completely determined that the GERD go ahead, and that also in the bargain, they get the port. It's a really tense situation. There's no obvious solution, but you have to at least hope that someone can get at least some of the parties involved in a room and talking. Because if that doesn't happen soon, this is going to go from bad to worse.
Yep. Well, and too, I mean, if you have this year, there wasn't a big famine, but if you go back to like 2022, 2021, there were very large famines in Ethiopia. That just puts more pressure on the government to do
Yeah.
something to act to stabilize itself. Because Ethiopia is so multi-ethnic and there are so many problems going on domestically within the country. The GERD really is one of the only things holding the country together. And if they can't maximize the leverage that they get from the GERD, since it was largely designed, well, they had an Italian company design it, but it was largely done by the Ethiopians with Chinese funding. This is really all they've got. And if they can't capitalize on this, then what is the government actually going to do to show legitimacy to the Ethiopian people? I mean, it's a huge, huge problem for them where they're kind of between a rock and a hard place as well, where they've got to continue to develop their country and they've got to get access to a port and have some sort of trade security and trade stability coming in. Otherwise, they're going to be up shit creek as well if something goes wrong. So there's so many things going on in
I mean,
this
I
equation
don't
and so many variables
I don't
that
disagree
it's
with
going
that.
to be very hard to find a simple solution.
That part 100%. I mean, the issue is they've gone about it, I think, in a very aggressive, very imperialistic kind of way, and it's biting them in the ass. And some of this, yes, there's some things that as a country I totally understand why you would go, we need to do this, we need to do that. But you also have to understand that telling people we're doing this, we're doing that, and then trying to steamroller over them is only going to take you so far. And I think that's what they're discovering right now. Um, and again, there's so many conflicting interests here. On top of everything else, what if something goes wrong? It spills over into the conflict in Sudan. What if the Sudanese parties get involved? What happens in Eritrea when Isaias Afwerki finally dies? What happens in Djibouti? I always forget the guy's name, so I'm not even going to try to do it. But in Djibouti, I think it's been the same guy for like 30 or 40 years. He's been there for a really long time. And, when he goes, it's not a democratic country. I think, he probably has a son or a nephew lined up, but it's not clear what's going to happen there. There's so many variables, and
Well, and you've got elections in South Sudan as well, potentially
oh,
coming up later this year.
oh,
So there's just
Dave, don't take me there, man. You're taking me to a terrible, I mean, not a terrible place. I have fond memories of people hoisting the South Sudanese flag in 2011. But that is a country that, again, talk about going from bad to worse. They've had like the worst possible time of it for the last 13 years. They've been independent for 13 years. They haven't had an election. They haven't had an election because they basically had a civil war the entire time. They're supposed to have one this year. My feeling is it probably won't happen. I think if it does,
shocker.
it's not going to be a good thing for anyone. Um, it's an incredibly, and again, the tragedy. All of these countries have some have just a complete bounty of natural resources. South Sudan has natural gas, oil, probably mineral deposits hidden away in the hills, and it's one of the poorest places on earth. Uh, Quality of life is below what anyone can really
It's as bad as it gets.
It's as bad as it
It's
gets.
it's literally as bad as it gets.
Bad as it gets, and it's also tense. It's also on the verge of another civil war breaking out, and this is, I think, right now the Horn of Africa is kind of like the Balkans during the period right before World War One. If one match gets lit, the whole thing goes up in flames, and that is going to have a massive effect on everyone because, as you and I know very well, Dave, if the Red Sea Strait becomes impassable, a lot of people are going to be very unhappy very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And we've had problems in the last couple months, and just imagine when it gets worse. If it gets worse.
Just imagine when it becomes impassable, because right now you can still put ships through it. I mean,
and this isn't saying a Taiwanese ship captain turns over his ship or her ship and blocks it for 2 weeks. This is going to be a lot worse than that.
This is going to be a lot worse if someone mines that strait, or even just blows up a couple ships, or there's regular conflict with an actual military force. It becomes very.
It'll make Captain Phillips look like child's play.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also, as you mentioned earlier, they import so many foodstuffs to that region. If you disrupt trade, there will be another famine. They're already on the brink of another famine. There will be another famine. It will kill millions of people. It will cause further unrest. And it will start spilling out of the region. It's going to go beyond the Horn. It will spill into Kenya. It will spill into Uganda. It will spill into the Congo and the Central African Republic and Chad. And this is where people get very uncomfortable, I think, for very good reasons. Anyways, on that really cheerful note, I think I'll try to wrap up. I did not, Dave, going into this, I didn't think I'm going to do a deep dive. I'm going to talk about every terrible thing that's happened in the last 5 years. But it's a part of the world I feel very passionate about. It's a part of the world that I really feel gets, and this is something we talk about, I think, every week. It's a part of the world that really gets neglected by the media in quote unquote Western countries. It's just not talked about very much. And it is so important because there's so much going on and it does affect the rest of the world. Just to end this, we were talking about Ethiopian Airlines at the very beginning. One of the most popular routes that Ethiopian Airlines has, and it's a route I've flown before actually, is DC to Addis. And the reason why is because so many people of Ethiopian descent live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Actually, if you count them, it's, I think, the largest city with people of Ethiopian descent besides Addis Ababa, that's including cities in Ethiopia. So there's an absolutely massive diaspora in America.
It's all around Northern Virginia too. So if you go back to DC and you go around Northern Virginia, there's all kinds of Ethiopian restaurants and grocery stores and all that kind of stuff. The food is really good.
The food's amazing. I miss the food so much, actually. Like, I live in a place with a cuisine that I like, thankfully, but Ethiopian food, I have just like so many happy memories of that place. But the Ethiopian diaspora is all over America. In Seattle, I was picked up at the airport by a fellow who probably came from Ethiopia at some point, I'm imagining. Is about my parents' age, who's obviously been in America a very long time. And they've settled in the sort of Seattle, Tacoma area. And I think, very prosperous immigrant community in America, and very influential on things going on back home. But yeah, they're a part of America, and we should be thinking about what's going on in this part of the world, because it's not just the Ethiopian diaspora, it's the Eritrean diaspora, it's the Somali diaspora, it's the Sudanese diaspora. They're spread out. And of course, they're affected by things going on back there. And, isn't it nice to know something about your neighbors? Sounds very Mr. Rogersy. I don't know where that came from, but I'm not. I stand by that sentiment.
I think you need to wear a sweater to school tomorrow, Gavin.
I'm not. No, 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 no. I'm not.
I think yeah,
No, you know what?
it's
I
sweater day. Even
switched
though it's going to be
over.
like 33, it's still sweater weather.
I,
33 Celsius.
I mean, no joke. And Dave knows what I'm talking about because we both lived in Indonesia. I'm currently living in a part of the world that has a similar mindset. Once it gets below like 30 degrees, people like start putting puffer jackets on and parkas, and you're just, I mean, I'm standing around, obviously not at school, but like I'm standing around in a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops going like, no, this is not. No, the switch I made lately, Dave, is I've decided that I can't wear patterned shirts to school anymore.
Oh,
No,
so solid or polka dot?
I mean, I know I'm a bozo to you, Dave, but really?
I don't know. I mean, you could be either or. You could get, when I was in China, I
Oh,
saw a shirt that was like half solid and like it was half stripe or half polka dot or half something. It was the weirdest shirt I'd ever seen in my life. And it was like they had, not quite enough material to make one shirt, but they had one half and one half and they just stitched it together. And I wish I would have bought it just because it was so bad and so ugly.
that
But if I ever see
sounds
another shirt like
horrible.
that is not patterned, I will get it and I will figure out a way to get it to you so you don't have to wear a patterned shirt anymore.
Well, I'm just, yeah, I'm sticking with the solid colors. And
All right.
I just feel like that's the way to go. That was a very big, oh, and now we're
You,
at the
you,
end
you
of,
just be careful and don't spill food on it because it's pretty obvious.
yeah,
Or your
particularly,
Kopi.
Anyways, let's wrap up. Ciao, ciao,
All
Dave.
right.